and subject to many other stressors, including habitat loss and climate change. We will show diverse and inspirational examples of how fishers and scientists have worked together to protect fish spawning aggregations with a focus on these species. The workshop presents new opportunities for collaboration on science and conservation, with all presentation materials going onto the outstanding Big Fish website and the HUVA site, which will remain open until the end of this year. Thanks to our guest presenters who mobilized in really short order to deliver extremely informative presentations. Thanks to all. Thanks to the workshop funders, the IUCN Species Survival Commission provided a grant to our specialist group for hosting the workshop on HUVA, and also Milky Wire funded Cordio in part for trainer costs. Thanks to Fadila Ali, our tech guru in many dimensions, and thanks also to Ana Salceda and Zelda Lesko of the Big Fish Initiative. I'm now pleased to introduce Dr. Melita Samoilys of Cordio, East Africa, a highly experienced coral reef ecologist and fishery scientist in the West Indian Ocean and beyond.
Thank you, Ken. That was a very nice welcome to me, but a warm welcome to all of you out there who've joined us in this global workshop. It's a real pleasure to be co-hosting it with Ken Lindeman and Will Heyman and Winston Cowie and Fadila Ali. So thank you all so much for attending. We've long wanted to share information globally on fish spawning aggregations for snappers and associated fishes, because the science and knowledge of fish spawning aggregations is really advanced in some regions, such as in the Western Atlantic and the Coral Triangle, while in others, like the Western Indian Ocean, where I work, our knowledge and understanding is fairly slim. Similarly, the great work on fishers' knowledge and how this knowledge is a leading light in our understanding of FSAs, as well as for fisheries management, is not well known all over the world. So we really wanted to try and bring it all together in this workshop. We're incredibly grateful for the enormous amount of free time that all the trainers and guest presenters have given to assembling the talks and the materials that you're about to hear. We really hope you enjoy the workshop and you leave it with some useful information, new tools, and particularly a new network of colleagues in our growing community of practice. I'm now going to hand over to Fadila Ali. She's the Assistant Executive Director of the Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute, and she's facilitating this workshop on this platform, HUVA, from her home in Trinidad and Tobago. Over to you, Fadila. Thank you.
Good morning, good evening, good night to all of you joining us here today. Just a little bit of logistics in terms of how this workshop will function. For those of you joined on Zoom, you should use the Q&A box to pose any questions you may have. You can pose questions throughout the presentations while we're in session. And at the end, there is a 30-minute time slot where we will try to address as many questions as possible by answering live. For those, if there are, due to the time constraints, if we are unable to answer any questions live, we will respond either via text or we can follow up via email. For those of you joining via HUVA, there's also the ability to chat via the chat. But we would encourage you both on Zoom and HUVA, if there are specific questions, to use the Q&A box, because the ones in the chat may get lost and we may overlook them. So I wish you all a very productive meeting. Thank you. And now I turn over to Will, who will be our moderator for this session. Will,
thanks, Fadila. Thanks so much for your introduction. And really, before we get rolling, I just really want to thank you and acknowledge you for the incredible, heroic job you've done to facilitate this incredibly complex workshop, building and running the HUVA website, taking care of all the invitations and registrations, and staying on top of all the complex logistics and coordination. It's amazing. And I also want to thank all of our participants. We've got over 400 people registered from over 65 countries and territories, which I guess gives us an indication of people's growing recognition of the importance of this issue. So welcome all. I echo the thanks that both Melita and Ken have offered to many. And so without further ado, I'll be serving as the moderator for this first section of the workshop. I want to remind and reiterate that we do have question and answers at the end of this hour for 30 minutes. We're delighted to have several guest speakers and guest panelists, including 2 fishermen that will be on board to answer questions. And I guess, yes, as a reminder, use that Q&A box to post questions, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. So let's roll. I'm going to introduce the first speaker, which is actually me. So I've worked with the Nature Conservancy in Belize for nearly a decade. I was a professor of marine geography at Texas A&M University and presently serve as a marine scientist with LGL Ecological Research. I'll be talking more about myself in my talk, so let it go at that. And my talk is Fish Spawning Aggregation, Definitions, and Introduction. Thanks for being here. Hello and welcome. I'm going to offer you some basic definitions and introduction to fish spawning aggregations. My name is Will Heyman. I'm a marine conservation scientist. I've been at it for over 30 years, which is why I'm showing you an old picture. My thread for my career has been science, but with a real focus on capacity building and working cooperatively with fishers, managers, and scientists with a real interest in catalyzing the creation of marine reserves. And in doing so, I've done it with the cooperation and participation of fishers who have become leaders. And most of those sites protect spawning aggregations. So this is really what I'm after. In terms of this talk, we cannot be comprehensive. There's too much good stuff out there. So what we're trying to do instead is really give you some seeds, give you some common understanding, and ultimately build a community of practice so that we can all work better together, learn from each other, and do better science and do better conservation. We all know that sea turtles gather in big numbers and breed or lay their eggs on nesting beaches. And we know that large rookeries occur in space and time, and people have recognized these and protected them because of their vulnerability. But we can't see underwater. Nonetheless, fish are no different than other species that aggregate to breed, and they also need protection. To get us on the same page, here's a definition of fish spawning aggregations. It's a repeated concentration of conspecific group of fish gathered for the sole purpose of reproduction. It's easier to understand it using video than these definitions on the side, so I'm offering both at the same time. These aggregations occur in predictable times and places with a density, a number of fish in the aggregation 4 times higher than outside the time and location of aggregation. They serve as a mass point source of offspring. Some of these aggregations are resident, occurring basically in the same place, very regularly, often on a daily basis. And some of the SSG species that we focus on this workshop form those types of aggregations, but the bulk of our species and really the focus of this talk is on transient fish spawning aggregations. They're critical for breeding, but they're also critical for feeding. For example, filter feeders like whale sharks and top predators like sharks. And as a result, they are concentrated, these transient spawners are concentrated in a very small place in time, and they're vulnerable because of their life history and their behavior, which influences fishing behavior. They're typically large-bodied, long-lived, often predators, slow to reproductive maturity, and put all of their annual reproductive effort into the aggregation time and place. As a result, you can see hundreds of thousands of fish that have all migrated long distances and aggregate in these very specific seasons and times, very short periods, very concentrated. And as a result, they're a great place to fish and have attracted fishermen where they occur all over the world. And that information is passed down over generations and has led to some real degradation of these vulnerable species. So that said, those fishers that use these places are exceedingly knowledgeable. And these gentlemen here have all been wonderful partners for research and in conducting conservation efforts. And there are similar fishers around the world who have done the same. I got this way of working largely inspired by Bob Johannes, who also inspired many of the presenters in this workshop and many others by showing the value of fishers' knowledge for FSA research and conservation. He spent several years working with fishermen like this gentleman here and documenting their traditional ecological knowledge based on interviews and interacting with them in the field. He summarized a lot of that knowledge in this magnificent book called The Words of the Lagoon, and I recommend it to all of you. And as he says in one of his publications, ignores fishers' knowledge and miss the boat. Fish spawning aggregations are globally important for both fisheries and biodiversity. Many of the largest global fisheries focus directly on fish spawning aggregations, for example, Atlantic cod, and I'll tell you that story in a minute, but also many small-scale fisheries. And as Yvonne Sadovi likes to say, you lose the FSA, you lose the fishery, you lose the livelihoods that depend on it. There's over 200 species of marine fishes in over 40 families that form FSAs, with some examples presented here, 3 of these being SSG species, a couple snappers, and a grunt, the sheep's head. And these sites are critically important for biodiversity conservation. Conserving aggregation sites helps reach the targets on the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as many of the Sustainable Development Goals. That said, our knowledge of FSAs around the world is very limited. We probably know a small percentage of the ones that are out there. The best comprehensive database describing or cataloging aggregations is available through the Science and Conservation of Fish Aggregations, and they have documented in various ways over 1,000 aggregations presently. Most of them, the status is unknown. The majority of those that are known are decreasing, and this leads to the reality that these places are very vulnerable. As a result of this exceeding pressure on these places, FSAs can be and have been extirpated or destroyed. For example, Atlantic cod that I mentioned, the fishery in Newfoundland, which harvested 800,000 tons in 1965, saw complete collapse by 1992. And the Nassau grouper, albeit not as much poundage, but for the region, for the Caribbean region, it was the largest fishery in the 1960s. But most FSAs are now depleted or no longer forming, and the species is listed by IUCN on the red list as endangered. Given that, it's also important to note that when you manage FSAs and manage them well, you can see recovery. Several examples here in the Cayman Islands, based on protection, collaboration with fishermen, excellent science, and other regulations. The Cayman Island, Eastern Cayman Island FSA increased or tripled in 10 years and continues to increase to this day. In the U.S. Virgin Islands, the size of red hine in a protected aggregation there has gradually but substantially increased since the late 80s. to the present. And we're going to hear more about another aggregation that has recovered in the Florida Keys by the talk by Munoz later in this session. To summarize, what we're trying to do here is to share best practices with you all, create some introductions and a communications platform. And we're offering links to an online toolkit and many other existing resources that will give more details as we go along. But we're 400 participants in 67 countries. Ideally, we'll be able to work more closely together, learn from each other, and help do good science and good conservation along with fishers throughout the world. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for that presentation. I hope that helps to put us all on the same page, get us going a little bit. And again, welcome all. Next up, we're going to hear from Winston Cowie. Winston is the Senior Manager of Marine Conservation and Fisheries for the Neom Nature Reserve in Saudi Arabia. It's been a pleasure to get to know him through this process. And in addition to many other accomplishments, Winston was the lead author of the IUCN Global Guidelines for the Gathering of Fish Knowledge for Policy Development and Applied Use. The guidelines and his extensive experience in fisheries management in the Middle East region form the basis for his talk, Introduction to Fishers' Knowledge and Approaches to Gathering FSA Information. Winston, take it away.
Hi, my name is Winston Cowie, IUCN Snapper, Seabream and Grunt Specialist Committee Member and Senior Manager of Marine Conservation and Fisheries at Neom Nature Reserve in Saudi Arabia. From New Zealand, I've been involved in marine conservation and fisheries work for many years, particularly in the Arabian region, and it is here that we've found this treasure trove of information amongst our fishing communities. Information that has massively supported us in developing fisheries policy and fisheries management measures. A little bit about our specialist group. We are a group of fisheries policymakers, fisheries managers, scientists, fishermen, working collaboratively across the globe on the sustainable management of 561 fish species across 5 families: snappers, sea breams, grunts, threadtail breams, and emperors. So why should you care about our fish species and mission? We are talking about the sustainable management of some of the most iconic fish species in the world. Snapper, as an example. Every Kiwi loves snapper. No favourites. Across these 561 species, they provide livelihoods for millions of people in small-scale fishing communities, billions of dollars in seafood, ecosystem services to the nearshore environment that they inhabit, but they're also some of the most prized, so in many cases they're under a lot of fishing pressure. We are doing our global and collaborative best to encourage best practice management of fisheries in small-scale communities. And we're particularly interested in fishers' knowledge and spawning aggregations. This workshop and training is all about the what is fishers' knowledge, the why should we collect fishers' knowledge, and there's many international conventions and action plans that give us the why. It's also about the how, because there's a very special way of collecting fishers' knowledge. How do you collect fishers' knowledge? And once you have, what do you do with it? You know, how do you transition that through to fisheries policy and management and other uses? So this workshop, particularly section 4 of this workshop, is all about the what, why, and the how. And we're going to be paying particular attention to the IUCN guidelines on the gathering of fishers' knowledge for use in fisheries policy and applied use. These guidelines tell you that fishers' knowledge, indigenous, traditional, and experience-based knowledge, as well as science, can provide valuable information for small-scale fisheries management, as well as providing this broader array, this basket of cultural knowledge. developed by 50 experts from 15 countries. Check out some of these successful examples of fishers' knowledge in policy and management from different parts of the world. Fishers' knowledge can be used in developing fisheries policy, fisheries management, developing co-management arrangements, IUCN red listing, and can be enhanced through songs, books, and film. And of course, fishers' knowledge is essential to establishing where spawning aggregations are, and we still have so many to find for our 561 species all across the globe, and it's really exciting to be working with everybody on this. During the workshop, you'll hear about the seminal work of Bob Johannes back in the 1980s. His work in Palau, Micronesia, is so well regarded. We'll also hear about Peter Gladding and the Gladding Memorial Award, which we'd like to bring to all regions of the world. We also look forward to working with our fishing communities in different parts of the world and policymakers and managers on the sustainable management and future sustainable management of spawning aggregations of these 561 species. Looking forward to seeing everybody in session 4. Thank you. Bye for now. Forwards.
Thanks, Winston. I really appreciate how you put it all in context there. And as a note to everyone, Winston's actually hosting the final session of the workshop tomorrow, focusing more on policy and the how to. And so look for that tomorrow. But meanwhile, our next talk is an amazing story that helps us understand and bring together a little bit of the past, right, and brings us right up to the present, where actually Richard Barnden will give this talk. He owns and runs a company called Unique Expeditions, which, among other things, brings dive tourists to witness the grandeur of fish spawning aggregations. His story brings us from the knowledge of ancient fishermen from Bob Johannes, passed down through generations, to the present, where he and dive guides in Palau are bringing tourists to these aggregation sites, and yet recognizing there's a growing need for managing this tourism as that industry takes off. So, so please enjoy this chat, this talk that he put together, bouncing back and forth between California and called The Words of the Lagoon and Snapper FSA Tourism. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Richard Barnden. I just want to say thank you very much for giving me the privilege of talking about something that I find pretty exciting that's been happening in Palau over the last 10 to 15 years. And that is recreational divers coming to dive fish spawning aggregations, which I believe has turned into one of the highlights of diving Palau. It's right up there with the Blue Corner. But obviously, these things are based around new moons and full moons, and so therefore dive shops, local dive shops in Palau and tour operators outside of Palau like myself have been bringing in clients to witness these amazing events. I'm just going to talk a little bit about my story. Dr. Collins from the Coral Reef Research Foundation. And he told me that Dr. Collins could predict when a Napoleon wrasse would spawn in Oolong. And like I mentioned, the same kind of thing happened. I've been diving here for a long time. I found it unbelievable that someone could predict when a Napoleon wrasse could spawn. And so obviously I tried to find out this information, read his research papers, and I kind of became addicted to trying to figure out as much information as possible and what other aggregations Palau had. And so obviously this manual for the study and conservation of reef fish spawning aggregations by Dr. Colin, Dr. Sadavoy and Dr. Dormira with SCAFRA, Science and Conservation of Fish Aggregations, was very beneficial for me. I read as much information as possible, along with another number of dive guides, and trying to figure out a little bit more. But the main book that got my attention, and what I would say was kind of like my Bible for spawning aggregations, was Words of the Lagoon by the late Dr. Johannes. I found it amazing that he was able to build the trust of the local fishermen, and was able to dive numerous aggregations in Palau, and this was back in the late 70s. And like I mentioned before, I hadn't heard of anyone else at that time, finding and researching these aggregations, and so that really got my attention. And also, obviously, the end story, which was being able to protect these events, these fish spawning aggregations, from overfishing, and so having some closure seasons, like the groupers, for instance, when they're aggregating and spawning, was extremely important, and I love the work that had gone on there. And one person that I would like to bring in, and I just did a small interview with Clayton. He's been a dive guide in Palau for more than 20 years, and he was working with Blue Marlin Dive Shop, who were the first people to discover the bumphead spawning aggregation. And I would just like you to hear his opinion and a little bit of what he'd like to say on the aggregations.
Ali, my name is Clayton. I'm a dive instructor. I've been diving for the past 20 years or so, and this is what I do every day, and I love the water, so I hope that this small interview will help you somehow.
Perfect. Can you just explain how you were involved with the bumphead parrotfish and how you first started diving this amazing event?
So the spawning for the bumphead parrotfish, first I asked the local fishermen who knew about the timing, and not only the bumphead parrotfish but other schools of fish. But this bumphead parrotfish kind of catch our attention. It was the first time we accidentally discovered that place, and we started learning their behavior, their timing. So it took us over a year, almost over a year and a half, just to find the perfect timing for the spawning of the bumphead parrotfish. And it starts a week before the phase of the new moon.
And can you explain a little bit about how long were you diving it before kind of other people started to show up?
Yeah, it took us like 2 years exactly to master that dive, and then we had the NHK to come down and document the spawning of the bumphead parrotfish. So it took us most roughly 2 years, because sometimes the weather will not permit, so we have to skip and then wait for the perfect day and then go back out. So that long.
And have you seen any changes over the last few years that have been different from when you first started diving these aggregations?
The number of divers has been very how I put this, there are more divers, especially for this bumphead parrotfish, because the site is very close and it's very how I say this, not so hard dive, and the number of divers is being another, how do I put this? It's been affecting the behavior of the pumped part fish, because when we started this was only us, and the fish was not really aggressive. That's what you do, and you stay and then you watch them. But now the new divers are chasing the puppet part fish, so this fish is trying to outsmart the divers. So sometimes it goes early or late, and
Anyway,
they're
I
trying,
think
and
we'll
sometimes
have to
they
keep
go
moving.
deep to get away from the divers.
The good
Yeah.
news is that.
And I know this is
All right, so I'm hearing it's okay on Kevin's end. I'm not sure what happened on mine.
pretty challenging topic, but what do you think? What could you think could help a little bit to improve this situation?
Well, we need especially the Gore state government and the national government to have a local person. For example, like me, I mean, I started this, I'm doing this with other divers, and so it needs the local expertise to work with the national government and the Gore state government to make regulate how to approach and dive with this kind of fish pond.
But anyway, let's move on. Yeah, so thank you, Richard and Clayton, for that. We're delighted you were able to provide this. The reality is that sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties. Here we go. Let's see. Yeah, no, the thing is that Richard provided this video, and it was longer than we could host, and yet the entire video will be available on the Big Fish website and on the Hoover recording. And so you'll be able to see a lot more information. We just had to shortcut, show a couple pictures, but actually in the full presentation, he's got a wonderful look at each of these species that they work on, and with a bunch of ecology and some magnificent pictures. So I encourage all of you to go and look at the full presentation when you get a chance. Next up, we have the honor and the pleasure of hearing from Ken Lindeman, Professor Emeritus from Florida State and the co-chair of the IUCN Specialist Group on Snappers, Sea Bream, and Grunt that is hosting this workshop. He's contributed hugely to the science and conservation of FSAs in Cuba and in the US and other places. And he's just about to present to you some groundbreaking new science on SSG species. So next, again, Ken will speak about SSG families, global diversity, and red list assessments, along with his graduate student, Sarah Brooks, who led the bulk of this analysis. Thanks, Ken. Take it away.
Hi, welcome. I'm Ken Lindeman. We're going to talk about the 6 families of the Snapper, Sea Bream, and Grunt Specialist Group of the IUCN, focusing on global and some regional diversity and red list assessment work. The outline consists of simply 2 basic themes. First, the families and their diversity, and then second, red list assessments. The Snapper, Sea Bream, and Grunt Specialist Group works to advance management and conservation of over 560 valuable coastal fish species with the efforts of many partners, including 65 expert members of the group. There are 6 families globally. We'll be seeing their scientific names frequently in future slides. Common names, of course, are the snappers, sea breams, grunts, but also the emperors, whip-tailed brims, and fusiliers. These animals distribute nutrients across habitats during development. Almost all species are fished. When I say across habitats, this is between sometimes seagrass and reef systems. A lot of very important nutrient dynamics with these organisms, and also they're very, very important in trophic webs. The array of families includes many iconic and really valuable reef and estuarine species globally. Hundreds of these species are subject to substantial fishing pressures from recreational, artisanal, and commercial fisheries, particularly the latter two, but in some countries the former as well. The table summarizes the 6 families and the number of species currently estimated within each family, the number red listed and the percent red listed. Almost 92% of these species now have red list ranks published on the IUCN Red List website. There's a lot of phylogenetic complexity and taxonomic challenges with some of these taxa, so these numbers can sometimes vary. The diversity of these species across these 6 families is really impressive. Clockwise across this slide, you have a sparrowed from Florida. In the middle, that school is black and white snapper. Plow. Top right, that's a sweet lips, genus Plectorhynchus. Guam. Below, a Lithrinid, an emperor. We've got also below that a Cesianid, a Fusilier. Then coming over to the left bottom, that's a whiptail brim, sometimes threadtail brims, Nemipterid. Then right above that, middle left, is the mutton snapper juvenile stage. We'll be hearing more about mutton snapper in various talks. It goes on and on. This is a small slice of an enormous collage of morphological and ecological diversity. Leading us to questions of evolution. We've got one quick summary slide. The evolutionary relationships among these families are based on a very complex literature that is highly dynamic and involves many different measurement tools. In consultation with the IUCN Marine Biodiversity Unit at Old Dominion University, the SSGSG currently considers Collette et al. 2022, the reference bottom right, to be the most conservative model of evolutionary relationships. This includes them in the order Perciformes, in the suborder Percoidea, the basal or intermediate percoids, and includes the 6 families we've mentioned, listed below with their common names. Keep in mind that in some sources the Cesianids, Fusiliers are put inside the Lugonidae, but we're keeping all 6 families currently. One of the attributes of these families is that they often have several dominant genera in terms of numbers of species at least. These primary genera include Lujanus within the Lugonidae, and then in deep water the Pristopomoides, primary here being 10 or more species. 4 sparrowed genera at least show that pattern as well. Then of course for the Heymulids, the grunts, you've got the Plectorhynchus, sweet lips, and across the Indian Ocean and Pacific, except the East Pacific. You've got Hemulon, very important genus across the Western Atlantic from Brazil up to the Carolinas. You've got Pomadesis is a very important estuarine species. And then for the other 3 families, you have species that tend to concentrate the diversity a bit as well. These genera have life forms that are very, very successful and have enabled a lot of adaptive radiation over time. The families in the Western Atlantic is scaling down to a regional summary. There's only 3 of the 6. The Lugonids and Heymulids can be very abundant with many species on reefs. Juveniles are common in seagrass, mangroves, and shallow hard bottom. Sparrows, the porgies, less abundant on coral reefs, but they can occur. Many species use seagrass habitats. Most of these species are again fished by commercial, artisanal, and in some cases recreational fisheries. In terms of the red list assessment status of the SSG species, the IUCN Red List has a variety of categories that are estimates of extinction risk. And the framework shown here is from the worst case down, extinct. And then we're focused on the beginning at critically endangered all the way down. The critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable ranks are considered to be threatened. Then there's near threatened, least concern, and data deficient. So there's a lot of ongoing work on this with a variety of folks. The next couple of slides are going to summarize some of the early findings of some of the more comprehensive work we're now doing. This slide shows the red list status estimations for all 6 SSG families pooled according to 5 red list ranks. Data deficient is the highest rank in this pooling, or I should say this breakdown, with over 60 species in that category. Near threatened, next highest. Then, in terms of threatened species, there's over 10 species among the 6 families that are ranked vulnerable. There's several that are endangered. Importantly here, the species that are least concerned are not plotted. Fortunately for this specialist group, the majority of species, that's several hundred, are least concern. There are a variety of other specialist groups for many different taxa, animals and plants and beyond, wherein the relative numbers of threatened species are much higher. So keep in mind here, this slide focuses on the species that we're most focused on in terms of management, but the great majority of species in this family that have been red listed are least concern. That doesn't mean that can't change for the worst. This slide breaks down the families themselves. You can see that the most challenged family in terms of risk extinction is on the left. That's the sparrows, the porgies, and sea brims. Again, least concern is not plotted here. The threatened ranks are in bold in the bottom x-axis label. So vulnerable is yellow, orange is endangered, red is critically endangered. Fortunately, we have no critically endangered species outside of the sparrows, and the majority of the vulnerable species are also in the Sparridae as well as the endangered species. There's a lot more to go into here. We expect this work to be continuing for some time, and there will be, of course, well, this work is indefinite because red listing never ends. Every 10 years you ideally want to be redoing your species, and there's also a lot of taxonomic changes requiring a lot of updates as well. But expect these numbers to evolve over time. We still have 8% of our species to finish red listing, and some of them are threatened as well. You've got an overview. Thank you very much for your interest. This slide thanks various folks. If you have any questions, there's a 30-minute Q&A at the end of this session.
Thanks, Ken. Really nice review. To everyone, you may know that Ken just retired, and I've been working with him over the last 6 weeks on this. I have never seen anybody work harder. And so for a guy that's retired, you know, I'm impressed. That said, when he did retire, he told me, wow, I'm really excited. Now's the time I can really focus on what I very much, care about and I'm passionate about, which is SSG, ecology, and management. Ken, you're off to a great start. Talk about hardworking. Melita Samoilys, our next speaker, was on vacation for last month, and she also was working constantly to get ready for this workshop. So thanks to you both for your extreme efforts. Melita is the director of Cordio East Africa, a non-government marine research and conservation organization based in Kenya. Among her other responsibilities and honors, she co-chairs the IUCN Specialist Group on Snappers, Sea Breams, and Grunts that's hosting this workshop. She's contributed to marine protected areas and fisheries policy development in 4 East African countries, with a focus on rights-based management, supporting coastal communities to improve resilience of the fisheries and ecosystems that they depend on in the face of climate change. Appropriately, her talk in this session is called SSG Species, Importance for Fisheries and Livelihoods. Take it away.
Hello everyone, welcome to this sub-session. I'll be presenting an introduction on the importance of our SSG species in fisheries and livelihoods. My name's Melita Samoilys. I'm from Cowie, East Africa, based in Kenya. In this subsession, I want to introduce you to the snapper, sea bream and grunt species that this specialist group works on. And you'll recognise many of them. And I'd like to show you how significant they are in fisheries around the world, both commercial and artisanal, and thus what livelihoods they contribute to. And then in the short talk, I'll take a deeper dive into a commercial fishery in the Gulf of Mexico, and then artisanal fisheries in East Africa, where many of our SSG species are commonly caught. I'll finish with a brief mention of the major threats, with an example from the Western Indian Ocean. This specialist group covers 6 families that are fairly closely related phylogenetically, and often they co-occur in the same ecosystems. There are over 550 species in these 6 families, which comprise, as you can see there, snappers, sea bream, grunt or sweetlips, threadfin breams, emperors and fusiliers. I've got 5 pictures there of the 6. Now, they occur throughout tropical and warm temperate coastal areas of the globe. They're commonly on coral and rocky reefs, also in estuaries, and therefore they're easily accessible to people. But they're also deeper and offshore on rocky or mesophotic coral reefs. Most of them contribute to fisheries, and with snapper and emperor being very common in commercial and artisanal fisheries, and also in recreational fisheries. So in terms of what they contribute in fisheries, they provide billions of dollars in seafood, food security, jobs and livelihoods. And as I said, they occur across commercial, artisanal, recreational and subsistence fisheries. The snapper, emperor and sea bream are particularly valuable in commercial fisheries. In the Atlantic, snapper are often lumped together with grouper in fisheries management in what is called the snapper grouper complex, because they often co-occur. And in fact, the RFMOs, the regional fisheries management organisations in the Atlantic and the Caribbean, are some of the most active globally for demersal fisheries. And this snapper grouper complex is a case in point, because these families are very valuable and important in commercial and artisanal fisheries. Recreational fisheries for these taxa are also important in more developed countries, for example in the Caribbean, the Atlantic and some parts of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. So trying to tease out metric tons and dollar values specifically for our SSG species or families is quite difficult. So I decided here to first provide a quick global overview on commercial fisheries, because they're the biggest in terms of volume and value. And here are some of the statistics from FAO and Global Fishing Watch to give us some perspective on the volume and value of commercial fisheries globally. So this is all taxa. So as you can see in the figures there, around 90 million metric tons of fish are caught globally each year. And FAO has assessed 30% of the world's fisheries as overfished and 60% are fished to capacity. In terms of livelihoods, commercial fishing supports the livelihoods of almost 60 million people. It ensures food security for over 3 billion people who rely on seafood as a primary protein source. And interestingly, $150 billion is involved in the global seafood exchange per year. So it's one of the most valuable food commodities that's traded. And they occur across 55% of the ocean, which is 4 times greater than agriculture. So it's easier to give you some specific examples, and I turn to the red snapper in the Gulf of Mexico, as you can see illustrated here with that enormous red snapper. The fishery crashed in the 80s, you can see that in the graph on the far left. So the government stepped in to control catches through IFQs, individual fishing quotas, and these were issued by NOAA. The slide shows in the pie chart the allocation for this fishery in the Gulf of Mexico for 2023. And as you can see, the total annual quota for both commercial and recreational was 7,400 metric tonnes. That's the total. And that gives it's hard to work values, but if you take the landings revenue value, it's about 32 million US dollars. Commercial fishery is allocated 51% and the recreational sector was allocated 49%. And there's two types of recreational fisheries, but I won't go into that now due to time. I'm going to turn now to very different fisheries, artisanal fisheries in Eastern Africa where I work. And these, you see these in Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique. And I'm going to look at these fisheries that take many of the species in our specialist group. They're characterised as multi-gear, multi-species with a mix of traditional gears and more mechanised gears. And many of them are unselective, particularly the gillnet. So the gears are unselective, and this is reflected in the sale and the marketing of the catches. So for example, a snapper or an emperor is as valuable as a parrotfish or a surgeonfish. They're generally aggregated in mixed groups and sold in local markets. There are some export markets, for example for deeper water snapper, often also called red snapper. So effective management of these fisheries is difficult, and there's very little species specific information available and little to no information on fish spawning aggregations. Turning now to give you an example from Kenya, where we first developed a fishing gear guidebook describing 15 coastal artisanal gears in use in 2011. This gives you all the specifics on each gear, its dimensions and materials, how it's used, typical species that it catches, etc. We then went on to study the catches of different gears to understand impacts on different species. We compared catches from 5 main gears over years, and I want to highlight some of the key findings significant to the SSG families. Livelihoods or emperors contribute significantly to these fishery catches across several gears, including traps, gill nets and hand lines. And the decline in the number of species taken in these gears over time declined. You can see the relative contribution of 2 species to basket trap catches increased up to 3-fold from 1999 to 2007, one of which is Livelihoods marcena, which is, as several of you will know, an endangered emperor. Juvenile capture across gears is also very high at 50%, and management's limited and regulations are poorly enforced. There is an opportunity to work with fishers in the management of these gears through locally managed marine areas, and this provides an opportunity to manage FSAs. We were successful with getting one community in Kenya to establish a closed area on a rabbitfish spawning aggregation. So to finish, I'd like to briefly mention the threats to SSG species populations, which are therefore threatening people's livelihoods from fishing. There are multiple threats, but climate change and fishing pressure are the predominant ones. And this is illustrated in this example from the Western Indian Ocean. In 2021, we published a red listing of ecosystems assessment of the Wyo's coral reefs. And you can see this illustrated on the left. So we broke the region into 11 eco-regions, and the results show that for overall the red listing assessment for the Wyo coral reefs was vulnerable. That's for the whole region. And each ecoregion had its own assessment. You can see the colours there, and they range from vulnerable to critically endangered. And the two drivers of this were fishing pressure with grouper and parrotfish as indicators, and sea surface temperature increases. So in summary, building resilience of these ecosystems and thus their fisheries and livelihoods is critical. And this is where managing FSAs comes in as a key conservation strategy. Thank you for listening, and see you soon.
Thanks, Melita. Magnificent talk, super articulate. Between that talk and that of Ken just beforehand, I think we've got an amazing look at the value of these fisheries, both for commercial and livelihoods, as well as the amazing diversity. Our next talk is from Dr. Roldan Munoz, fishery research biologist with the U.S. National Marine Fisheries Service, NOAA, Southeast Fishery Science Center. He specializes on fishes in coral reef and rocky reef ecosystems, reproductive ecology, and spawning aggregations in marine protected areas. He's presently involved with a comprehensive collaborative research program describing the multi-species aggregation site at Riley's Hump in the Florida Keys. And so without further ado, please welcome Roldan Munoz in his talk, Riley's Hump, Conserving a Multi-Species FSA Based on Fisher Knowledge and Leadership. Take it away.
Hello, my name is Roldan Munoz, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about Riley's Hump, which is a site of a multi-species fish spawning aggregation in the Florida Keys region. Riley's Hump, as I indicated, is located approximately 130 kilometers southwest of Key West. You can see the general location with the purple arrow here, as well as black arrows indicating the circulation pattern in the region. It was identified as the most important spawning aggregation site in the lower Florida Keys. Riley's Hump has a long history of commercial fishing, starting with 1968. And longline fishing occurring in the late 70s, removing significant biomass, followed by fish traps in the 80s, and the declining catches that became apparent in the 80s. Given these declining catches, the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council instituted a spawning season closure in 1992, and then following between 1998 to 2000, Tortugas ecological reserves, a planning and design process occurred with the formation of the Tortugas 2000 work group, which was a community-based group that included representatives from a variety of different stakeholders, including commercial fishers and recreational users and state and federal government, NGOs that reviewed scientific and socioeconomic information to make recommendations to NOAA on the size, shape, and placement of a proposed ecological reserve in the region. Tortugas 2000 process was viewed widely as successful due to the fact that all members were given equal voice in the design of the process. Both scientific and local ecological knowledge was considered in the design, and the group utilized a professional facilitator over the course of 13 months to work out differences and issues associated with the design. Also at the time, little recreational fishing was taking place far offshore in the Tortugas region. And another important contributor to the success of the process was Peter Gladding. Peter Gladding was a Tortugas 2000 working group member. He was a commercial handline fisherman with over 40 years experience in the Tortugas region. And he had personally fished the spawning aggregations at Riley's Hump and had witnessed the decline of these aggregations despite prior limited closures. So during the working group process, Peter endured personal risk, but convinced fishermen to accept the full-time closure. And it was the respect that he had in the process that helped them accept closure and his significant knowledge of the region. So at the time, the Tortugas Ecological Reserve was the largest U.S. no-take marine reserve. And Peter's expert knowledge, as well as his fishing vessel, the Alexis M platform, was instrumental in early documentation of the mutton snapper spawning aggregation by scientists. The South Ecological Reserve and Riley's Hump is well characterized with benthic maps and classification of different habitats. The approximate depths in the area of 30 to 65 meters. Diving is prohibited and vessel entry is only permitted during continuous transit and with fishing gear stowed. So the science and monitoring in the region includes early study by Domeyer and Collin to document mutton snapper, although that study only saw small numbers of individuals and no observations of spawning were made. Burton et al. Later conducted repeated visits and studies there and observed single individuals in the early parts of that study to the potential reformation of a spawning aggregation of approximately 300 fish. Later, Locascio and Burton deployed acoustic hydrophones to document elevated sound production by black grouper, red grouper, and red hind during their winter spawning season. Later, Feely et al. Used acoustic telemetry to document repeated migrations of mutton snapper from nearshore habitats to Riley's Hump over the course of multiple years. And they were also able to observe a large aggregation of approximately 4,000 mutton snapper and make confirmed observations of spawning. And Feely et al. Also observed a variety of different reproductive behaviors and spawning colorations from a number of different species, including the ocean triggerfish seen in the photo here. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, or FWC, has used a variety of different methods to document a Cubera snapper aggregation that was later discovered over the course of 2011 to 2016. And FWC maintains an acoustic telemetry array as well as passive acoustic hydrophones, and has been acoustically tagging groupers since 2014. And more recently, Munoz et al. Are continuing the documentation of the Cubera snapper aggregation, as well as the documentation of elevated multi-species biomass associated with a specific geomorphological feature at Riley's Hump. And then presently, the status of the region includes increased frequency of large predators, such as sharks, and it is a remote location, so limited poaching likely still does occur. And then for the future, an 18 square mile expansion has been proposed to capture additional habitat known to support fish spawning aggregations. So recognizing the significant contributions of Peter Gladding, the Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute instituted the Gladding Memorial Award, which includes travel to GCFI for the winners that are based on fishing experience and the conservation actions of the candidates. And a first award was presented to Don De Maria in 2004. Also, in 2006, the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary and the state of Florida named their sanctuary enforcement vessel in honor of Peter Gladding's conservation contributions to the sanctuary and to the region. And with that and these acknowledgments, I'll thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Roldan. That's such an inspiring story for all of us. And I'm glad that you mentioned the Gladding Memorial Awards. We are honored to have two GMA winners along with us as panelists. But before I go on, I just want to remind all of you as guests in the workshop that we'd love to have your questions. And the easiest, best way to do that is by posting them in the QA box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll do the best we can to answer those questions live, but if there are too many, we can get back to you subsequently. So again, let me introduce, you've already been introduced to our presenters, Melita Samoilys and Ken Lindeman and Roldan Munoz. But in addition, like I say, we have two panelists that are fishermen and winners of the Gladding Memorial Award. The first is Mitch Lay from Antigua and Barbuda, commercial fisherman who has also been instrumental in leading Caribbean management, bringing Caribbean fishers into the management process by being instrumental in helping put together something called the Caribbean Network of Fisher Folk Organizations. He's online and we'll ask him to speak in a moment. But before that, I'm going to ask that Don DeMaria, who was involved intimately in the Tortugas process, along with Peter Gladding and others, to give his perspective on how that process went down and his perspective on aggregation. So Don, if you're there.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Oh, good, good. Yeah, the Tortugas, especially Riley's Hump, was a unique situation. It was, at the time, it was a little bit too far away for recreational fishermen to really fish comfortably. It was before the days of the 3 and 4 outboard engine boats. And back then in 2000, there was still enough fish around Key West and the lower Keys where you didn't have to go that far. So there wasn't a whole lot of opposition from the recreational sector on it. Today, I think it'd be different because they're fishing out further than way past Riley's Hump on day trips now. And I'm sure there'd be a lot of opposition for any kind of reserve. And with commercial fishermen, there was some opposition in the beginning, but then over time, you know, the area got pretty well beat down. So it wasn't like they were losing a whole lot. The area was pretty well beat up. And even back in the day when they were catching huge numbers of mutton snappers, the price went so low that nobody was really making any money off it. They were sending out fish on consignment and selling them really cheap. So it's kind of there wasn't as much opposition as you would think. Today, I think there'd be a lot more. So it kind of went through fairly easy towards the end. Of course, Peter Gladding helped. We had somebody that really knew the area and had the respect of a lot of fishermen. He drew the boundaries. And at the last meeting, I remember Peter drawing them on the map with his finger and saying, this is what we should set aside. And the fishermen all looked at it and said, yeah, that looks good. And Boy Causey said, you mean we're finished with it? That's it? And we all said, yeah, that's it. Let's go have a beer. And we all celebrated. So it was a unique thing. But as far as aggregations go and just fishing in general, there's not a lot known about these aggregation sites. It seems they get fished out before the scientists really get out there and document it. It's not like the American West when it was settled and there were artists and writers and poets and whatnot that went along and pretty much recorded everything. When fisheries got exploited, there were very few artists or writers or poets on the fishing boats. They just got exploited and there was no real record of it. The only real record is in the minds of the fishers. So it's important, I think, to involve the fishers and get their knowledge on what's going on out there, because they're probably really the only link to where these aggregations existed and how many fish were there at one time. And a lot of them want to help. A lot of them realize that you can't keep catching these fish when they're aggregated like this and spawning and expect to have a sustainable fishery. So some of them get it, some of them don't, but a lot of them do. And it's involving them. Peter Gladding was perfect example. Without him, I'm not sure we would have got this one through. So involve the fishers.
Thanks, Don. You continue to inspire me and inspire others. It's really, really great to have you here. And thanks again for your years and years of contributions. No, just great. We've got a question in the chat. We've also got Kevin Rhodes online. But before we do that, I'd love to hear again from Mitch Lay, commercial fisherman in Antigua and Barbuda, and his perspective on bringing fishers into this process. Mitch, are you there?
I'm here. Thanks, Will. Good day to everyone. It's great to be here, and I just want to say that it's so important for us to not only bring fishers in, but to treat fishers with a certain level of respect, because this is where relationships start and develop. And of course, fishers are primarily concerned about their own sustainability as people, to feed your families, etc. So our concern for the health of the ecosystem is real. I mean, this is real. And so we want to be involved also because of the fact that we have intimate knowledge as well. We are in the field 24/7, at least one of us, and 365. So, I mean, we have, yes, a wealth of knowledge, experience, skills, and we're willing to collaborate. But let's generate an atmosphere of respect and participation that allows for that involvement. I really appreciate the GCFI atmosphere. We not only recognize fishers, but we facilitate the participation on a level playing field. And at the CNFO, we are also, primarily concerned about developing the consciousness in fisherfolk in the Caribbean that seeks to promote responsible fisheries. So we've actually developed a code of conduct for Caribbean fisheries as well. And these are the sort of things that we want to continue engaging in. So certainly we applaud this move to share information, but also the focus on involving fisheries in this particular process. Thanks, Will.
And thank you, Mitch. Again, so inspiring, such a pleasure to have you here and to have collaborated with you over all these years. We've got a lot more good things to do, and maybe it involves working with some of our colleagues and brothers and sisters on the other side of the world. So we've got a question in the Q&A chat. And I'm going to take a quick stab at the answer and then pass it on to Kevin Rhodes, who has joined us as a panelist. So the question from an anonymous attendee says, "Thanks so much for an excellent session so far. If a country had to commence FSA research, would you suggest baseline studies with fishers as the starting point?" Answer: absolutely. And that said, depends on where you are in the world. I think that Melita will be quick to tell you that not everywhere in the world do fishers actually know about these places, but there are many in which they do. So I guess what I want to do in brief is point to tomorrow. We've got a lot of information in session 3 where Melita will be chairing, and we've got a lot of information on how to actually go about developing an FSA conservation program. Obviously, fishers are important, but we'll also look at landing statistics and geomorphology and all kinds of other things. So with that, I'm going to, if you're ready, Kevin, I'm going to pass that question over to you and/or get your perspective on other things you might like to add. You're muted, Kevin. You're muted.
All right. Thank you, Will. Yeah, I want to say that this is a great opportunity for everybody to learn about spawning aggregations and management and some of the concerns, and to bring the fishers' voices in. Fishers are very important. They're actually integral to every part of our research and every part of management and conservation development. For locating spawning aggregations, landing sites, spawning aggregation fishing, which actually does occur, and sometimes you'll stumble upon that, markets, those are all really the best places to start, because all the evidence that you need is there. Then you just need to identify what it is that you're looking for and follow the trail. And that will eventually, with the trust of the fishermen, if you can gain the trust of the fishermen, will lead you to the site. And then you can start working with those folks to help develop the management that you need to protect those aggregations.
And you'd know well, Kevin, as you know, having worked on this in both the Caribbean and the Pacific, one of few of us who's worked on both sides, worked intimately with fishermen. You know, you're certainly an expert on the subject, and I'm glad we'll have you talking tomorrow as well. I see, Melita, you've got your hand up. What do you got for us?
Oh, I just thought maybe I've got a chance here to actually talk about some old work I did on the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. And I located the spawning aggregation sites of a grouper that's a very popular target grouper in the commercial and recreational fisheries there. And the person who helped me find that was Lyle Squire. And I'd like to give a big shout out for Lyle Squire because he was a commercial spear fisherman. And when he started telling me about these aggregations, and this is like late 80s, late 80s, he said, but no one's listening to me because I'm just a fisherman. And I said, I've read about these. And of course, it was Words of the Lagoon. And I said, let's get some money and go and find them. And we found them. And I can tell you, there was a lot of skepticism in the scientific community at that time in northern Queensland. And I would never have found them without Lyle. And I'm a huge believer in working with fishermen on this phenomenon. That was a grouper, so I won't talk any more about it because we're here for the snapper and associated families. But yeah, they've got to be part of the picture, definitely. Thank you.
Thanks, Melita. It's a good reminder. I had the distinct pleasure of having Bob Johannes come and visit when I was working in Belize, and took him diving the first time we were really diving on a Cubera aggregation with whale sharks coming here and there, and Bob Johannes was there, and he waxed on and on about Lyle Squires and showed us all these pictures and everything else. So it was really fun to have him chatting with the fishermen that I work with. Anyway, yeah, no, it's magic stuff. We can both fishermen and scientists can create more and do more together than either of us could apart. So anyway, I've got a question online here that I want to get to. Let's see. It says, really enjoying the great talks and the idea, love the science and iconic careers in different paths. I was wondering if folks could share what they found to be the most impactful part of the process: locating FSA, documentation, studying, dissemination of knowledge, and the parts of the process you find having the greatest impact on the fish and the fishers relying on these. I'm going to take a quick stab and then invite others to chime in. To me, the two most impactful things that I've been involved with or that I've seen is one, fisher exchanges. We brought fishermen that I was working with in Belize to Indonesia, actually, to work with colleagues, fishermen, and scientists. And we brought groups back and forth to dive aggregations, to meet with policymakers, protected areas managers, specialists, and it was amazing. And that was one of many, many fisher exchanges. We've done bunches of them between various countries, and it is so powerful. And so that's one. And the other is training workshops. And Kevin and I led, as far as I'm aware, an epic training workshop back in 2003. In Belize, we had 60 people from 9 countries. And I think the outcome from that in terms of people's involvement in working on this and science and the number of fishermen that got involved and spread that word was exponential. So I'm going to leave that as my two contributions. If someone else has other answers to that question, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, just being part of that process, Will, I think is key. So in the United Arab Emirates, we had a severely overexploited fishery. The science said it, but we needed to obtain the fishers' views. So we went all around the Emirates to the Ras Laiki landing sites and sat there with the fishermen, and and their view is exactly the same as the science. You know, the fishery is severely overexploited, and we need a recovery plan. And that recovery plan was implemented 5 years ago, and since then we've seen a big increase in the fish stock. So for me, on the impact side, it's going through that process and actually sitting with the fishermen and gathering this rich sort of basket of knowledge, and then the impact of the policy and seeing the fish stock head in the right direction. Yeah, I mean, everyone's got many stories, but it's a pretty cool and charming thing to be involved in.
Thanks, Winston. You're right on. And yeah, at some point, ideally, we'll all be able to be in the same place at the same time and share more of these stories, because that's where the real magic is. We're doing our best online, but I think I want to bring back one point that that Mitch made earlier, and that is that involving fishers is key, but at the same time, it's not all about conservation. These are livelihoods at stake, and sometimes it's possible, and there's examples where aggregations could or might be able to be fished sustainably. And so I don't think there's any magic bullet on this, but yeah, I mean, let's do the science together. Let's do the management together, and do things that make sense. So we've got. Does anyone else want to chime in on that particular subject? Otherwise, we've got another question online. All right, and this is this is actually a question that says, since we have fishers attending, can they speak about the best practices when engaging with fishermen? Which actually we'd love to hear from Don. We'd love to hear again from Mitch, if you guys are able.
So I'll let Don take the first shot, and I can offer some comments as well.
Don, you there? Why don't you go ahead, Mitch?
Yeah, so while we're waiting on Don, I'll just make a couple of comments. So I think I'll touch maybe 3 or 4 basic points that need to be considered when you actually engage in fishers. And I think the first and most important point, there must be some recognition of the value of the fisher's input, but also some recognition that the fisher has to take out from his livelihood generation time to participate. And this is a critical element, because we do find a lot of fishers who probably have a lot of deep and broad knowledge may not participate because there's not that recognition that it costs the fisher something to participate. I think that's an important thing. And then the whole idea of supporting that participation and facilitating the fisher's participation. So that also is a critical element. When you consider engaging fishers, consider some level of support and facilitation. In other words, there are specific idiosyncrasies in dealing with fishers, and this has to do perhaps with the level of formal education. And we're not talking about intellect, we're talking about education. And therefore, that has to be considered in terms of relevance in the way you communicate, so that you're communicating at a level that fishers can not only relate to, but can engage without any sort of intimidation. And then the third area that I really want to perhaps note is the fact that there must be a respect for the contribution, and that respect must be reflected in the results. Now, this is a critical element, because as a fisher, we participate initially, and then there's no process to indicate that our participation has any meaning at the end. And that is when there's a final report, or there's a final measure, or something like that. So there must be that level of respect to say that the fisher's participation is important enough to make an impact, and to be considered. So I just want to stay with those 3. We could actually discuss some more, but I think those are really critical. Thanks, Will.
Thanks so much, Mitch. this is why we're so delighted that you're here. And this is, yeah, you're right on. And I think for many of us, we get that, and yet at the same time, I want to encourage all scientists and all managers, as we work with fishermen, to recognize just this, exactly that. I mean, these guys are serving as consultants and should be paid as consultants and should be credited as consultants all along the way. And so I really appreciate you bringing that up, Mitch. So anyway, other comment, Don, are you ready to say a word on that particular subject, or should we move on to the next question? There's Kevin, and I'm going to pass it to you. And also I want to let, oh, never mind. Great. Let's hear from you, Kevin.
I just wanted to say thanks, Mitchell. I think those are excellent points. I think all of us recognize that work with these, with aggregations and with the fisheries and with fishermen to try to make these places sustainable. And I think you hit all those points right on the head. I appreciate your input.
Ken, you want to say a word?
Just wanted to mention, folks might not be aware, Mitch and I co-chaired the Gliding Memorial Award Committee of the Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute in the first decade of the century. And Mitch is foundational to many of the best DNA of the Gliding Memorial Award. And the main point is that the GMA was developed to address everything you just ticked off on your list, Mitch. Starting with recognizing fishers who dare to fish sustainably. It's not easy in many cases, and as you listed some of the most explicit challenges, and there's others as well, as you know better than I. So Mitch is very close to not only the challenge side of this issue, but also the partial solution side of the issue, which is rewarding fishers for sustainable fishing. That's a key component of the Gliding Memorial Award, and folks will see tomorrow and in the next session, session 2, but also the sessions tomorrow, that we're very much focused on working with folks anywhere in the world to try to export the GMA model. It doesn't have to be the GMA. Every region needs to self-develop its own ways of rewarding sustainable fishers and fishing leaders. But this is a great segue, Mitch, from what you were saying, from that great question, to what we are hoping to do explicitly with this workshop. It's in the original proposal to the IUCN, is that whether it's GMA type incentive-based awards to turn excellent men and women into fishing ambassadors, whether it's other things, we are eager to work with folks to try to catalyze TEK, FK, and even new levels beyond the Gliding Memorial Awards.
Thanks, and thanks again both to you, Don, and to you, Mitch, for your participation across the board. I also want to give a shout out to one of our participants, another GMA winner from recently, Mimi Stafford from the Florida Keys, a sponge fisher woman who also won the GMA just recently, and another real superstar in terms of her contributions to marine conservation as well. And so thanks for joining us, Mimi. We're just about out of time. We have one more question that Ken, did you see the question in the chat, Ken, or is that something that we should wait till tomorrow to address, because it's really having to do with management? It's do you see the question there, or should we call it, because we're just about out of time for this session? You're muted, Ken.
Trying to stay out of the way. Looking at this long question, there's a long, interesting question that came in on the chat. It's a little harder for us, but trying to read it all. Hold on. My observation is that institutionalizing FSA needs policy support and linkages to other actors, such as the Fisheries Department of the FAO. In particular, connecting FSAs to small-scale fisheries, artisanal fisheries sectors is strategic in the voluntary guidelines for small-scale fisheries. there are potential areas for synergies on FSA. I think that this is, I agree, Melita had a comment, really good question. This is a very good question. Many of the FSA issues we're talking about are naturally embedded in the DNA of the whole, multi-species, small-scale fisheries, community-based fisheries worlds that exist in the research communities and in the NGO communities and within the agency communities and increasingly within the fisher folk communities. So a great, comment here, the voluntary guidelines for small-scale fisheries, many, many other resources are out there. Can FSAs come more into them? Do they need to be explicitly impact wrenched more into some of this? Certainly, and it doesn't probably require impact wrenches. I think there's just many examples of success now in bringing fishers into the lead, bringing and enhancing the science with the fishers, which enhances the management. So towards that question, I think most of us would say yes. And we look forward to talking further with anyone who wants to expand on this.
Thanks so much. And thanks to all our presenters, thanks to our panelists, thanks to those asking questions, and thanks to everyone both attending live and that will be seeing these presentations recorded on the Big Fish Initiative website. And so with that, I'm going to end our first session and we can move to the second one. Thanks so much to everybody.